Well, so delighted to welcome Petar Nenadov. Did I say that right? I've been working on it? Okay. He's the pastor of Lakeside Christian Church. He's the author of The Promised One, Matthew. And he also works with as the regional development specialist for Made to Flourish. And Made to Flourish has blessed many of us. But Petar, would you come and just share your heart with us?
It's a joy to be with you, and one of the contributions that I want to offer to this conversation is how to take so much of the goodness that we've been hearing and to think about what it would be like to intentionally instill it on our teens and children. So if I offer something to you, that is one of the ways that as I encountered these ideas and been a part of this conversation for a long time, that in my own mind and heart, God has been working and stirring in me. Part of that is I think I'm the first millennial on stage at this point. There might be one after me. I think I'm the oldest you can possibly be as a millennial. And like my brother Kevin Dudley said last night, as he described himself as never totally fitting in anywhere and therefore fitting everywhere, I realized when he said that, that's why we're kindred spirits, because I could describe myself very much in the same way. But I have 3 young boys. My oldest is about to turn 7, Levi. About 2 years ago, when we had our normal routine at home and it was time for bedtime snack, I asked him, Levi, what do you want for bedtime snack? And he gave me a one-word answer: options. What do you mean, option? I'm asking you what you want. This isn't the Great Depression or something. We have options. I'm asking you what you want. But it was a pregnant word. There was much behind it. In ancient Greek theater, there was sort of 2 plays that unfolded, comedies and tragedies. And the way typically you distinguish the 2 is a tragedy starts off with so much promise and potential. And as the story unfolds, the options become increasingly limited, where you realize it's going to end a certain way and they can't escape it. And a comedy starts with a lot of difficulty and struggle, seemingly no hope. But as the story continues to unfold, new possibilities and worlds are opened. Options become available to them. And I believe our lives as followers of Christ are to reflect a comedy. That wherever we've come from and whatever our story is, in whatever ways we are able, we are to give increasing possibilities and options to people that are before them in the name of Jesus. Yeah. For me, in a personal way, that happened because my family immigrated from Eastern Europe here to America. My mom was 12 years old when she came. My dad was 16. Both of my parents were part of a tradition in Eastern Europe that suffered a lot of persecution for their faith. Both of my grandfathers served prison sentences for refusing to join the Communist Party in the former Yugoslavia. And they could tell then stories to me of their cousins, friends, my parents' aunts and uncles who'd experienced imprisonment, suffering, and persecution for being followers of Jesus. So I had this weird dynamic where I grew up in Akron, Ohio, but because of my family story, I just assumed that if you're a Christian, at some point, you will go to prison. Because almost everyone I knew growing up had that as part of their story. That when they were committed to their faith and the things that they believed, they had to believe it even to the point of suffering. Be willing to suffer a cost that might come from that. But those who could and when they could decided to flee. So the grandfather that I'm named after, and therefore why Petar is spelled funny, it's the Slavic spelling, Petar is how you would say it in Serbian. When he decided to take, at what is my age now, his wife and family of 5 kids and escape, he couldn't make it look like he was trying to escape. So he couldn't sell his house. He couldn't empty his bank account. He had to make it look like he was just going on vacation. And then when he crossed the border, claimed status as a refugee. This Thanksgiving is the 50th anniversary of my family making it to Akron, Ohio. And he never could have known in that moment that just now, 4 years ago, his grandson, who carries his name, flew back to Serbia and taught at a theological school freely and openly, under no threat of persecution. So partly because of my own family story, I am fascinated and try to zoom in on the accounts of Scripture where there were those moments of persecution for the people of God. And one of them is in the book of Daniel. And it is so amazing, the opening chapters of Daniel, when you consider young people being taken from home and family, culture and language and worship, and at a very, very young age, able to stand strong in their faith. Where did the faith of Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, and Daniel come from? So young, so tested, and so beautifully and gloriously passed that test, could overcome the pressures that came their way. Before Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who we often hear as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were threatened with a fiery furnace, they expressed their absolute confidence in God's ability to deliver them, and then said, even if he doesn't, we're not giving in. And that was a supernatural work of God to instill that kind of faith in him. And so I don't want you to hear the next part as a process by which that always happens, but there is a backstory to that faith. And so as you've been given many homework assignments of areas of Scripture that you could read and follow up and think through what it means to hand off our faith to the next generation, what it means to allow our young people to be empowered quickly. Before those 4 young teens were in Babylon, there was a young king named Josiah. Does anyone remember how old Josiah was when he was made king? 8 years old. And in his 18th year, which is 26 years old, as the king of Judah, the law is discovered again. And he institutes, as a young leader, systematic reforms in the nation, though it had already been prophesied that exile was going to happen. So he didn't even have the option of saying, I'm going to commit to the Scripture and we're going to do this so that exile doesn't take place. So just like Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah could say, we believe in God, but even if he doesn't deliver us, we're going to do this. There was a king who said, even if this doesn't prevent ultimately the punishment of God upon our sin that we deserve, I am going to do the work I've been called to do. I'm going to be faithful in my generation. I'm going to bring about the reforms that need to take place. And doing a study of King Josiah and the prophet Jeremiah, who was also told the same thing. Jeremiah, calling you to be my prophet. In your lifetime, you're going to see no fruit. How does that sound? Does that sound like a job you want to apply for? No. But where does the faith of Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Daniel come from? It is born in this backstory. And they could stand in exile and overcome temptation because of the faithful endurance of those who had gone before. And then they were exposed to increasing options and opportunities in a new land that surprised them all, that Daniel would rise to such prominence in a foreign land and have the opportunity to influence so many people. What a wonderful story. And we have this obligation to transfer, to pass on, to instill as young as possible and as early as possible these ideas and themes, and to allow them to be tested early on so that this faith can be formed for others. When we think about it in terms of finances, I was at a conference one time on faith, work, and economics, and someone was talking about wealth, and I said, you know, what distinguishes the wealth of the United States, for example, from the wealth of Saudi Arabia? He said, oh, that's simple. The key word is capital. Capital is wealth exposed to risk. And in Saudi Arabia, you have a lot of wealth controlled by a few and not exposed to risk. And what we have here that has created an amazing amount of generation of wealth is that no matter how wealthy anyone is in this room, no one is keeping all of your stuff in your mattress in your home. You are all together only insured up to a certain point when you put your resources into a bank, because we believe that the way to be most secure is to expose what we have to risk. And then that risk is available for other people to go to college, to buy a car, to start a home. And the more that we expand that opportunity to other people, our resources are actually more secure than if we hoarded them all and then we just had to build the biggest fortress around our house as possible. And so in letting go of and handing to others, we create this amazing spiral of transfer, of passing on. And we want to do that with our kids. So for me, I'm a pastor of an ordinary church. Lakeside Christian Church formed as a merger of two churches 10 years ago. And I had the gift of, when I came to this congregation, we were now next door to one of the largest churches in our area. And the church had undergone some difficulty and transfer in its leadership and was wondering, where are we going to go next? And I had the opportunity to come as a part of this merger and just say, for us to be faithful to what God has called us to do, no other ministry or church has to fail. Just like Chris said, we are not in competition with any other group. We're not trying to become anyone else. We want to learn and discern what it means for us to be faithful where we are in our gifting and our calling and what he's called us to be. We already were losing the battle if we said, if we just do everything they do, people will come here. No, they won't. They're already going there. They're still going to go there. We can't replicate it. And that's not what God is calling us to do. He's calling us to be faithful in our day. So then as I had the opportunity, but therefore the congregation also was willing to take a risk and bring on, in what was a difficult church situation, and bring someone on as a lead staff person at 27 years old. And so I've now been there for 10 years, 37. I've learned a lot, and they've learned a lot. So they brought me on not because I was an expert at anything. They were willing to expose themselves to risk. With wisdom, there were mature, older leaders in the congregation, but there was this culture of willingness to grow together and learn together and hand off the baton, as Chris was saying. And so a few years ago, in attending a few events similar to this, one of them was in Grand Rapids, I brought my associate and youth pastor, Brad, and two other young professionals in my congregation, and we attended a conference, and we said, we're just an ordinary church, but as we're hearing these ideas, what are the gaps in our own church and ministry that we might be able to help with? And one of them was assessing how much we heard people say, I wish someone would have told this to me many years ago. I wish someone early on in life would have told me that you really could serve Christ in any which way. And so we said, you know, wouldn't it be great to teach specifically a class for our teens and get their parents involved in the class so that they're having this conversation, which they're going to have anyway, about whether or not you're going to attend college, if you are, what college you're going to attend, and what you're thinking about your vocational choices in the future. At this point, we had never spent any time thinking that that was important material to go over in class. And so we said, let's get together as a team, let's develop something. We said, what are we going to name it, and how are we going to sketch it, and how often will we do it? So we called it Compass, is an opportunity for teens with their parents to consider together their vocational calling, to realize early on that they really can serve Christ anywhere in the world and that they can basically take on responsibility whenever they choose to. That being an adult is not what someone else will tell them. It's something that they can embrace whenever they're ready for it. And if they're willing to embrace it, if they're willing to take on responsibility, then they can do that. And so we developed it. It's a resource that you can look up, compassclass.org, because once we developed it and we taught it in our class to our church, we said we've created it. We don't have any proprietary authority or rights to it. And we just gladly, if any other organization or church or youth ministry or individual thought this would be helpful, that we would gladly pass it on to them. But our assessment was that thousands of dollars are put towards college, but often without students even knowing what they want to do, what they're gifted for, or how their faith relates to their work. And so we wanted to step into that space. At that point, we probably had 10 to 12 teenagers in our youth group. And so we said, if we create this class and we say we want the parents in the class with them, so that's 10 to 12 kids with maybe hopefully 20 to 25 adults sitting in the class with them, then we can have we can facilitate the conversation with them on these important themes. So one of the things we did that I'll have you do around the table initially was just to get them to consider together the importance of thinking through these categories as early as possible. And so we haven't had as much time already today to kind of process around tables, and you might be sitting with someone differently than you were yesterday. But even if you weren't, you probably haven't talked about this yet. Just go around the table real quick, reintroduce yourself, and tell at the table, what was the first thing you remember getting paid to do, and how did it affect you to get paid to do it? Can you do that in 3 minutes? Real quick, just go around the table. What's the first thing you remember getting paid to do? Was it babysitting? Was it landscaping? What was it? All right, I'm going to bring us back to attention. You might not have gotten all the way around the table. You might not have gotten all the way around the table, but I'll bring us back to attention. You learn really unique things about people when you talk about how old they were, what they did, and for us, getting our teens to hear what their parents did when they used to be teenagers, to just kind of put them both on the same playing field and then thinking through, how did getting paid to do something affect the way you thought of it? And for almost everyone, it's this greater sense of responsibility. I don't know if I'm an adult yet, but I feel like I'm kind of getting there. If someone's saying they can't just make me do things anymore, like someone's got to encourage me in some other ways to do it. And we talked about a theology of work, that God is a worker. He has made us to work, that work precedes the fall, and what are all the implications of that? Then the second time we get together, we have everyone talk about what's the most frustrating thing you've ever done? Like someone could not pay you enough to do what you had to do. It was nasty and it was dirty. And what was that? And then everyone can go around a table and think of a story and their experience and say something along those lines. And then we talk about different examples in the Bible of how the reality of the fall affecting all of our work. And so no one has just a pure, clean story. Moses and David were asked to take on jobs they weren't specifically trained for. They tried to say, God, you sure? Me? Or when Samuel was coming to pick the next king, wait, we weren't even going to show you him. Wait, he has no training for this. And we have examples of people who do really good at their work, like Solomon and Saul, but then they got to a point of not glorifying God in their work. And then we have people like Jesus and Paul who worked temporary jobs, even though God had greater missions for them. My first opportunity to work for a church was in part-time youth ministry, so I had to do a lot of things to supplement income, and one of them was rough construction. And we were on a roof one day, and one of my coworkers was like, look at us, we're such losers. Look at what we do for a living. So I said to him, Jesus was a carpenter? And he was mad. Like, he wanted to cuss because he knew I called him out on something. But it was, oh yeah, I guess I didn't even think about the fact that Jesus was a carpenter. No, he didn't do roofing. It was carpentry first century style. But still, we might look at that and say, the Son of God come into the world to redeem the world? What a waste of time to learn a trade that his father knew. Paul, in Corinth, by necessity, tent making. Do you know why they needed tents in Corinth in the first century? Why people needed temporary housing when they were coming to the temple of the goddess Artemis? It was as pagan as it got. It was like building hostels in Vegas. It's not, I'm doing noble work on the side. This is as godless of a place as it gets. I need to earn some income, and this is what I'm really good at, and I'm going to do it. And God used that to plant a church in Corinth so no wonder when you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, it's the most messed up church in the New Testament. But how kind and good of God to do something like that there. I'm out of time, so eventually it develops, but what we then did was to reverse engineer the class. If our goal was about 30 people in the class, then we interviewed people in the church when we said, hey, we're going to do a class for some of our teens. Could we ask you about your work? And it would help us in this class. We'd gotten these questions from another church in Phoenix called Redemption Church, but they did all of life interviews in their congregation. So they asked 4 questions about work. How would you describe your work? What are some ways your work is a reflection of God? How does your work provide insight into the brokenness of this world? And how does your work function as an opportunity to love and serve your neighbors? So we could then go to 30 people in the church and say, would you mind interviewing? Would you mind just answering these questions? And all of them were like, great. So now we're at over 50 people thinking through these questions as it relates to work in a congregation of 200. And we're saying, this is wonderful. We pretty quickly got a number of people asking these questions about their work. And so we got a sales manager, a physical therapy assistant, a quality control manager, an appeals judge, a fine artist, a social worker, a podiatrist, a homemaker, an engineer, and a nurse. That we took from the 30 into 10 and put them together in this class to share. And then we just had everyone in the class read those testimonies together. Like you read a testimony of a missionary, like you sometimes read a testimony of someone serving in the church. Here were testimonies to read about people serving in a whole variety of vocations. And one of them I loved, a lady filled out 2 separate ones because she said, I'd like to fill it out in my previous career as a social worker, and then lastly, now as I've transitioned to being a homemaker. Because a lot of times when we do talk about work, we forget about all the unpaid work that is done. But is just as critical as all the other work we do. And we still worship God through our work, whether that work is paid work or not paid. And so when she filled that out as it related to homemaking, and then we had everyone read it, and I said, now what I want you to know is you just read a testimony that you thought was from 2 different people, but it was from the same person, describing their work in social care, coming alongside cancer patients, and then their work at home, raising their kids. And again, it brought it home to me that we should think of the opportunities we have on a regular basis to pass on things to the next generation. Because Moses gave all the people of Israel the commission and the vocation to make sure they're raising their kids in the faith. He commanded them, you teach your kids these laws, these rules. Don't rely on anyone else to do it for you. This is your responsibility to teach them and instruct them in the faith. So I found this quote from C.S. Lewis was once asked his opinion on someone who was disgruntled because they weren't getting paid for their work, because their work was primarily in the home. And he wrote, I think I can understand the frustration that this housewife was describing. But here's C.S. Lewis's response. What do ships, railways, miners, cars, government, etc. exist for, except that people may be fed, warmed, and safe in their own homes? We wage war in order to have peace. We work in order to have leisure. We produce food in order to eat it. So the job of homemaking is the job for which all others exist. And I think it takes the greatest teacher in human history to put all of these ideas in such a simple prayer that we can all say it at a very young age, all the way till now, together as his body. And so pray it with me. Our Father, who art